Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. Welcome to Bud Mouse. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting history. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story.
Are you ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. This shout out is for our friend. Okay, here they go. Maybe. Come on. This one? This one? Oh. Come on, there we go. Alright. Now we got it. The ducky's going out. Looks like in the lead we've got Michael, who I think I forgot to take off. That's okay. We won't worry about that right now. I'll take you off the list, at least for this week, or for this year. And Michael is definitely in the lead. Oh, Rita's catching up. Wells is pulling neck and neck. Sheila's not far behind. Surfer's going ahead. Surfer's new to us, so that could be cool. Ghost Watchers is also new, and they're catching up. They are definitely in the lead. Oh, Sheila's vlog is pulling ahead. Here we go, here we go, here we go. Sheila's vlog is in the lead. Oh, Herman, I'm sorry about your duck. I'm sorry about that ball. You didn't choose the ducks. Oh, here comes Tracy. Tracy is our winner. All right, Tracy Rubin is our shout out today. This is her channel. She has not reached 500, as you can see. She says she will be doing a variety, the description reads, "Hi everybody, welcome to my channel. Here I will be doing a variety of videos pertaining to natural hair care, cooking, baby care, arts and crafts, self-care, small business." She's also a strong believer in Christ. Head of my life. I don't know what that means. I'm confused, but religious, which is good. Everybody should have a religion of some sort, or at least believe in a higher power. That's kind of religious, I guess. Anyway, check Tracy out. Like, share, comment, see if we can get her up to that 500. Have a good day.
All right, Mr. Doe, tell us something interesting.
All right, well, today's little history lesson, we're borrowing a page out of my wife's handbook, and something she came across that's kind of interesting regarding Amelia Earhart. Now, for those of you who've been living in a cave in the last, 100 years or so, Amelia Earhart, born and raised in Atchison, Kansas, and later in Des Moines, Iowa, developed a passion for flying and adventure at a young age, steadily gaining flying experience from her 20s. In 1928, Earhart became the first female passenger to cross the Atlantic by airplane, with a pilot accompanying her, Wilmer Schultz, for which she achieved celebrity status, and in 1932, piloting a Lockheed Vega 5B, made a non-stop solo transatlantic flight, becoming the first woman to achieve such a feat. She received the United States Distinguished Flying Cross for this accomplishment. In 1935, she became a visiting faculty member at Purdue University and an advisor to aeronautical engineering and a career counselor to female students. She also was a member of the National Women's Party and an early supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment. Known as one of the most inspirational American figures in aviation from the late 1920s throughout the 30s, her legacy was often compared to early aeronautical career of pioneer aviator Charles Lindbergh, as well as close figures like First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt for their close friendship and lasting impact on the issue of women's causes from that period. During an attempt to become the first woman to complete the circumnavigational flight of the globe in 1937, a Purdue-funded Lockheed Model 10E Electra, Earhart and navigator Fred Noonan disappeared over the central Pacific Ocean near Howland Island.
Bye-bye.
Last two were seen in Lae, New Guinea on July 2nd, 1937, on the last land stop before Howland Island, and one of their final legs of flight, presumably died in the Pacific during the circumnavigation just 3 weeks prior to her 40th birthday. Nearly 1 year and 6 months after she and Noonan disappeared, Earhart was officially declared dead, and investigators and significant public interest in their disappearance still continue over 80 years later. Decades after her presumed death, Earhart was inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame in 1968 and the National Women's Hall of Fame in 1973.
I didn't know there was a National Women's Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Something for Angela to go check out.
Yes, she'd like that.
She now has several commemorative memorials named in her honor around the United States, including an urban park, an airport, a residence hall, research museum, a research foundation, a bridge, a cargo ship.
A bridge?
That is really weird.
Also, cargo ship is weird.
So is an earth-filled dam.
Yes.
What's it got to do with flying? I don't know. 4 schools, a hotel, a playhouse, a library, multiple roads, and more. She also had a minor planet, planetary corona, and a newly discovered lunar crater named after her. She is ranked 9th in the Flying's list of 51 heroes of aviation. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the beginning.
We're going backwards?
Yes.
Okay.
Born in July 24th, 1897, Atchison, Kansas, the daughter of Samuel Aaron Stanton Earhart, who lived 1867 to 1930, and Amelia Amy Earhart, 1869 to 1962. She was born in the home of her maternal grandfather, Alfred Gideon Otis, who was a former federal judge, the president of the Atchison Savings Bank, and a leading citizen of the town. Earhart was the second child of the marriage after an infant was stillborn in August of 1896. She is parted German descent. Alfred Otis had not initially favored the marriage and was not satisfied with Edwin's progress as a lawyer. Grandpa was grumpy. According to the family custom, Earhart was named after her 2 grandmothers, Amelia Josephine Harries and Mary Wells Patton. From an early age, Earhart was the ringleader, while her sister, Grace Muriel Earhart, 2 years her junior, acted as the dutiful follower. She passed away just recently in 1998.
Huh.
Amelia was nicknamed Mealy, sometimes Millie, and Grace was nicknamed Pidge. Both girls continued to answer to their childhood nicknames, well until adulthood. Their upbringing was unconventional, as Amy Earhart did not believe in raising her children to be nice little girls, but their maternal grandmother disapproved of the bloomers they were, and although Earhart liked the freedom of movement they provided, she was more sensitive to the fact that the neighborhood girls wore dresses. Now, early influence, the spirit of adventure seemed to abide in the Earhart children, with the pair setting off daily to explore their neighborhood. As a child, Earhart spent long hours playing with her sister Pidge, climbing trees, hunting rats with a rifle, and belly slamming her sled downhill. Although the love of outdoors and the rough-and-tumble play was common to many youngsters, some biographers have characterized the young Earhart as a tomboy. The girls kept worms, moths, katydids, and a tree toad.
Oh, yeah, she definitely tomboy.
In a growing collection gathered in her outings. In 1904, with the help of an uncle, Earhart cobbled together a homemade ramp fashioned after a roller coaster she had seen on a trip to St. Louis and secured the ramp to the roof of the family tool shed.
Well,
you
that
see
sounds
where this is going, don't you?
Oh, no, this sounds safe. This sounds very safe.
Earhart's well-documented first flight ended dramatically. She emerged from the broken wood shed, the broken wood box that had served as the sled, with a bruised hip, a torn dress, and a sensation of exhilaration. She exclaimed, "Oh, Pidge, it's just like flying!" Although there has been some missteps in Edwin Earhart's career up to that point, in 1907, his job as a claims officer for the Rock Island Railroad led to a transfer to Des Moines, Iowa. The next year, at the age of 10, Earhart saw her first aircraft at the Iowa State Fair in Des Moines. Her father tried to interest his daughters in taking a flight. One look at the rickety flyer was enough for Earhart, who promptly asked if they could go back to the merry-go-round. She later described the biplane as a thing of rusty wire and wood, not at all interesting. Sisters Amelia and Muriel, who went by their middle name from the teens on, remained with their grandparents in Atchison, while the parents moved into new similar quarters in Des Moines. During this period, the Earhart girls received homeschooling from their mother and governess. Amelia later recounted that she was exceedingly fond of reading and spent countless hours in the family library. In 1909, when the family was finally reunited in Des Moines, the Earhart children had enrolled in public school for the first time, and Amelia, 12, entered 7th grade. Now, while the family's finances seemed improved with the acquisition of a new house and even the hiring of 2 servants,
I was going to say they're hiding the servants?
Yes, they're hiding the servants under the stairs.
Well then.
It soon became apparent that Edwin was an alcoholic. 5 years later, in 1914, he was forced to retire, and although attempted to rehabilitate himself through treatment, he was never reinstated to the Rock Island Railroad. At about this time, Earhart's grandmother, Amelia Otis, died suddenly, leaving a substantial estate that placed her daughter's share in a trust, fearing that Edwin's drinking would drain the funds. The Otis house was auctioned off with all its contents. Earhart was heartbroken, later described it as the end of her childhood. In 1915, after a long search, Earhart's father found work as a clerk at the Great Northern Railway in St. Paul, Minnesota, where Earhart entered Central High School as a junior. Edwin applied for a transfer to Springfield, Missouri in 1915, but the current claims officer reconsidered his retirement and demanded his job back, leaving the elder Earhart with nowhere to go. Facing another calamitous move, Amy Earhart took the children to Chicago, where they lived with friends. Earhart made an unusual condition in the choice of her next schooling. She canvassed nearby high schools in Chicago to find the best science program. She rejected the high school nearest her home when she complained that the chemistry lab was just like a kitchen sink. She eventually enrolled in the Hyde Park High School, but spent this miserable semester where her yearbook captured the essence of her unhappiness. A.E., the girl in brown who walks alone. Sounds almost like somebody was playing with a fortune teller. You're going to have this as a curse. Thanks. Earhart graduated from the Chicago's Hyde Park High School in 1916. Throughout her troubled childhood, she had continued to aspire to a future career. She kept a scrapbook of newspaper clippings about successful women in predominantly male-oriented fields, including film direction and production, law, advertising, management, and mechanical engineering. She began junior college at Oregon School in Rideau, Pennsylvania, but did not complete her program. During the Christmas vacation in 1917, Earhart visited her sister in Toronto. World War I had been raging, and Earhart saw the returning wounded soldiers. After receiving training as a nurse's aide from the Red Cross, she began to work with the Voluntary Aid Detachment at Spadina Military Hospital. Her duties included preparing food in the kitchens with patients with special diets and handing out prescribed medication at the hospital's dispensary. There, Earhart heard stories from the military pilots and developed an interest in flying. When the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic reached Toronto, Earhart was engaged in the arduous nursing duties that included night shifts at the Spadina Military Hospital. She became a patient herself, experiencing pneumonia and maxillary sinusitis.
Wow.
She was hospitalized with pneumonia in early November 1918 and was discharged the next month, about 2 months after the illness had started. Her sinus-related symptoms were the pain and pressure around one eye and copious amount of mucus drainage via the nostrils and throats. While staying in the hospital during the pre-antibiotic era, she had suffered painful minor operations to wash out the affected maxillary sinus, but these procedures were not successful, and she continued to have worsening headaches. Her convalescence lasted nearly a year, in which she spent at her sister's home in Northampton, Massachusetts. Earhart passed the time by reading poetry, learning to play the banjo, and studying mechanics. Chronic sinusitis successfully affected her flying and activities in later life, and sometimes even on the airfield she was forced to wear a bandage on her cheek to cover a small drainage tube. Now, early flying about that time, Earhart and a young woman friend visited an airfield fair held in conjunction with the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto. The interest aroused in me in Toronto led me to all air circuses in the vicinity. One of the highlights of the day was a flying exhibition put on by World War I ace. A pilot overhead spotted Earhart and her friend, who was watching there from an isolated clearing. This person dived at them. "I'm sure," he said to himself. "Watch me make them scamper," she said. Earhart stood her ground as the aircraft came close. I did not understand it at the time, but I believe that the little red airplane said something to me as it swished by.
Oh.
By 1919, Earhart...
She's an airplane whisperer.
Airplane whisperer. There it goes. By 1919, Earhart prepared to enter Smith College, where her sister was a student. However, she changed her mind and enrolled in a program in medical studies and other programs at Columbia. She quit a year later to be with her parents, who had reunited in California. On December 28, 1920, Earhart and her father attended an aerial meet at Doherty Field in Long Beach, California. She asked her father, Edwin, to ask about passenger flights and flying lessons. She was booked on a passenger flight the following day at Emory Rogers Field at the corner of Wilshire Boulevard and Fairfax Avenue. The cost was $10 for a 10-minute flight with Frank Hawks, who later gained fame as an air racer. Hawks gave her a ride that would forever change Earhart's life. By the time I got 200 or 300 feet off the ground, I knew I had to fly. The next month, Earhart recruited Netta Snook to be her flying instructor. The initial contract was for 12 hours of instruction for $500. Working at a variety of jobs, including photographer, truck driver, and a stenographer at the local telephone company, she managed to save $1,000 for flying lessons. Earhart had her first lesson on January the 3rd, 1921, at Kidder Field on the west side of Long Beach Boulevard and Tweedy Road, now in the city of Southgate. Snook used a crash-salvaged Curtiss JN-4 Canuck that Snook had restored for training. In order to reach the airfield, Earhart had to take a bus to the end of the line and then walk 4 miles. Earhart's mother also... Huh?
That's a long walk.
Yes, it is. Earhart's mother also provided part of the $1,000 stake against her better judgment. Earhart's commitment to fly required her to accept the frequent hard work and rudimentary conditions that accompanied early aviation training. To complete her image transformation, she also cropped her hair short in the style of other female flyers. 6 months later, in the summer of 1921, Earhart purchased a second-hand bright chromium yellow Kidder Airster biplane against Snook's advice, which she nicknamed the Canary. After her first successful solo landing, she bought a new leather flying coat. Due to the newness of this coat, she was subjected to teasing, so she aged the coat by sleeping in it and staining it with aircraft oil.
Well then.
Make it fade in. On October the 22nd, 1922, Earhart flew the Airster to an altitude of 14,000 feet, setting a world record for female pilots. On May 16, 1923, Earhart became the 16th woman in the United States to be issued a pilot's license by the Fédération Aéronationale Internationale, or the FAI. Now, through the 1920s, following a disaster investment in a failed gypsum mine, Earhart's inheritance from her grandmother, which was now administered by her mother, steadily diminished until it was exhausted. Consequently, with no immediate prospects for recouping her investment in flying, Earhart sold the Canary, as well as a second Kinner, and bought a Yellow Kisser Goldbug Speedster 2-seat automobile, which she nicknamed the Yellow Peril. Simultaneously, Earhart...
I think she likes yellow.
Yes, she does. Simultaneously, Earhart experienced an exacerbation of her old sinus problem as the pain worsened, and in early 1924 was hospitalized for another sinus operation, which was again unsuccessful. After trying her hand at a number of ventures that included setting up a photography company, Earhart set out in a new direction. Following her parents' divorce in 1924, she drove her mother in the Yellow Peril on a transcontinental trip from California with stops throughout the western United States and a jaunt up to Banff, Alberta. The meandering tour eventually brought the pair to Boston, Massachusetts, where Earhart underwent another sinus operation, which was more successful. After recuperation, she returned to Columbia University for several months, but was forced to abandon her studies and any further plans of enrolling at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology because her mother could no longer afford the tuition fees and associated costs. Soon after, she found employment first as a teacher, then as a social worker in 1925 at the Dennison House, a Boston settlement house. At this time, she lived in Medford, Massachusetts. While living in Medford, she maintained her interest in aviation, becoming a member of the American Aeronautical Society's Boston chapter, and was eventually elected its vice president. She flew out of the Dennison Airport, later the Naval Air Station Squantum in Quincy, Massachusetts, and helped finance its operation by investing a small sum of money. Earhart also flew the first official flight out of Dennison Airport in 1927. Along with acting as a sales representative for Kinner Aircraft in the Boston area, she also wrote local newspaper columns promoting flying, and as her local celebrity grew, she laid out plans for an organization devoted to female flyers. After Charles Lindbergh solo flight across the Atlantic in 1927, Amy Guest expressed interest in being the first woman to fly or be flown across the Atlantic Ocean. After deciding that the trip was too perilous for her to undertake, she offered to sponsor the project, suggesting that they find another girl with the right image. While at work one afternoon in 1928, April, Earhart got a phone call from Captain H. Hilton Rayleigh, who asked her, "Would you like to fly the Atlantic?"
No.
The project coordinators, including book publisher and publicist George P. Putnam, interviewed Earhart and asked her to accompany pilot Wilmer Stoltz and co-pilot mechanic Lewis Gordon on the flight, nominally as a passenger, but with the added duty of keeping the flight log. The team departed from Trespe Harbor, Newfoundland, in a Fokker F-7B/3M, nicknamed Friendship, on June the 7th, 1928, landing near Bury Port, South Wales, exactly 20 hours and 40 minutes later. There was a commemorative blue plaque at the site. Since most of the flight was instruments, and Earhart had no training on this type of flying, she did not pilot the aircraft. When interviewed after landing, she said, "Schultz did all the flying, had to. I was just baggage like a sack of potatoes," she added. "Maybe someday I'll try it alone." Earhart reportedly received a rousing welcome on June 19, 1928, when she landed at Woolston in Southampton, England. She flew the Airvo Avion, owned by Lady Mary Heath, and later purchased the aircraft and had it shipped back to the United States, where it was assigned unlicensed aircraft identification mark 7083. With the Stoltz, Gordon, and Earhart flight crew returned to the United States, they were greeted with a ticker tape parade along the Canyon of Heroes in Manhattan, followed by a reception by President Calvin Coolidge at the White House. Now, trading on her physical resemblance to Lindbergh, where the press had dubbed Lucky Lindy, some newspapers and magazines began referring to Earhart as Lady Lindy. The United States press was more grandiloquent to them. Earhart was the reigning queen of the air, and immediately took after her return to the United States. She undertook an exhausting lecture tour in 1928 and 1929. Meanwhile, Putnam had undertaken to heavily promote her in a campaign that included publishing a book she authored, a series of new lecture tours, and using pictures of her in a mass market endorsements for products, including her luggage, Lucky Strike cigarettes. This caused image problems for her, with McCall's magazine retracting an offer, and women's clothing and sportswear. The money she made from the Lucky Strike had been earmarked for a $1,500 donation to Commander Richard Bride's imminent South Pole expedition. The marketing campaign by both Earhart and Putnam was successful in establishing the Earhart mystique to the public psyche. Rather than simply endorsing the products, she actively became involved in promotions, especially for women's fashions. For a number of years, she had sewn her own clothes, but the active living lines that she sold in 50 stores, such as Macy's in the metropolitan areas, were an expression of the new image. Her concept of natural, simple lines matched with wrinkle-proof, washable materials, and the embodiment of a sleek but personal, feminine AE, the familiar name she went by with family and friends. The luggage line that she promoted, marketed as Modern Air Earhart Luggage, also bore her unmistakable stamp. Wide range of promotional items bearing the Earhart name appeared. Now, celebrity endorsements helped Earhart finance her flying. Accepting a position as associate editor at Cosmopolitan magazine, she turned this forum into an opportunity to campaign for greater public acceptance of aviation, especially focusing on the role of women entering the field. In 1929, Earhart was among the first aviators to promote commercial air travel through the development of a passenger airline service, along with Charles Lindbergh. She represented transcontinental air transport, later the TWA, alongside Margaret Bartlett Thornton, and invested time and money into setting up the first regional shuttle service between New York and Washington, D.C., the Ludington Airline. She was vice president of National Airways, which conducted several flying operations in the Boston Maine Airways and several other airlines in the Northeast, and by 1940 it had become Northeast Airlines. Now, although Earhart had gained fame for her transatlantic flight, she endeavored to set her own untarnished record of her own. Shortly after her return, piloting the Avion 7083, She set off on her first long solo flight that occurred just as her name was coming into the national spotlight. By making the trip in August 1928, Earhart became the first woman to fly solo across the North American continent and back. Her piloting skills and professionalism gradually grew, and she acknowledged her experience acknowledged by experienced professional pilots who flew with her. General Leigh Wade flew with Earhart in 1929, saying she was a born flyer with a delicate touch on the stick. Earhart subsequently made her first attempt at competitive air racing in 1929 during the first Santa Monica to Cleveland Women's Air Derby, nicknamed the Powder Puff Derby by Will Rogers, which left Santa Monica on August 18th and arrived in Cleveland, Ohio on August 26th. During the race, she settled into fourth place with the heavy planes division. As the second-to-last stop in Columbus, her friend Ruth Nichols, who was coming in third, had an accident on the test flight before the race commenced. Nichols' aircraft hit a tractor at the start of the runway and flipped over, forcing her out of the race. At Cleveland, Earhart placed third in the heavy division. In 1930, Earhart became an official of the National Aeronautic Association, where she actively promoted the establishment of separate women's records and instrumental in the Federation Aeronautic International, FAI, accepting a similar international standard. On April 8, 1931, she set a world altitude record of 18,415 feet, flying a Pitcairn autogyro borrowed from Beechnut chewing gum. I didn't know Beechnut chewing gum had an aircraft. During this period, Earhart became involved with the 99th, an organization of female pilots providing moral support and advancing the cause of women in aviation. She had called a meeting of female pilots in 1929 following the Women's Air Derby. She suggested the name be changed on the number of charter members. She later became the organization's first president in 1930. Earhart was a vigorous advocate for female pilots, and when the 1934 Bennett Trophy race banned women, she openly refused to fly screen actress Mary Pickford to Cleveland to open the races. Now, Earhart was engaged to Samuel Chapman, a chemical engineer from Boston. She broke off the engagement on November 23, 1928. During the same period, Earhart and publisher George Putnam had spent a great deal of time together. Putnam, who is known as GP, was divorced in 1929 and sought out Earhart, proposing to her 6 times before she finally agreed to marry him. They married on February 7, 1931, in Putnam's mother's house in Nona, Connecticut. Earhart referred to her marriage as a partnership with dual control. In a letter written to Putnam and hand-delivered to him on the day of the wedding, she wrote, "I want you to understand I shall not hold you to any medieval code of faithfulness to me, nor shall I consider myself bound to you similarly." She continued, I may have to keep some place where I can go to be by myself now and then, for I cannot guarantee to endure at all times the confinement of even an attractive cage. Earhart's ideas on marriage were liberal for the time, as she believed in equal responsibilities for both breadwinners, and pointedly kept her own name rather than being referred to as Mrs. Putnam. When the New York Times, per rules of the style book, insisted on calling her Mrs. Putnam, she laughed it off. Putnam also learned that he would be called Mr. Earhart. There were no honeymoons for the newlyweds, as Earhart was involved in a 9-day cross-country tour promoting autogyros, and the tour sponsor Beechnut Chewing Gum. Although Earhart and Putnam never had children, he had 2 sons by his previous marriage to Dorothy Binney, a chemical heiress whose father company, Binney and Smith, invented Crayola crayons. The explorer and writer David Binney Putnam and George Palmer Putnam. Earhart was particularly fond of David, who had frequently visited his father at the family home, which was on the grounds of the Appowamus Club in Rye, New York. George had contracted polio shortly after his parents' separation and was able to visit as often. Now, on the morning of May 20th, 1932, 34-year-old Earhart set off from Harbor Grace, Newfoundland, with a copy of the Telegraph Journal, given to her by journalist Stuart Truman, to confirm the date of her flight. She intended to fly to Paris in her single-engine Lockheed Vega 5B to emulate Charles Lindbergh's solo flight 5 years earlier. Her technical advisor for the flight was famed Norwegian-American aviator Bernd Balchen, who helped prepare her aircraft. He also played the role of decoy for the press, as he was obstinately preparing Earhart's Vega's flight for his own Arctic flight. While the flight lasted 14 hours, 56 minutes, which had to contend with strong northerly winds, icy conditions, and mechanical issues, Earhart landed at a pasture in Colmore, north of Derry, Northern Ireland. The landing was witnessed by Cecil King and T. Sawyer. When a farmhand asked, "Have you flown far?" Earhart replied, "From America." As the first woman to fly non-stop across the Atlantic, Earhart received the Distinguished Flying Cross from Congress, the Cross of Knight of the Legion of Honor from the French government, and a gold medal from the National Geographic Society from President Herbert Hoover. As the fame grew, she developed friendships with many people in high offices, most notably First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Roosevelt shared many of Earhart's interests and passions, including women's causes. After flying with Earhart, Roosevelt obtained a student permit but did not further pursue her plans to fly. The two friends communicated frequently throughout their lives. Another flyer, Jacqueline Cochran, who is said to be Earhart's rival, also became her confidant during this period. Now, there were additional solo flights. This one is pretty much going to be tomorrow when this is broadcast. January 11th, 1935, Earhart became the first aviator to fly solo from Honolulu, Hawaii to Oakland, California. Go Raiders. This time, she used a Lockheed 5C Vega, although this transoceanic flight was attempted by many others, notably by the unfortunate participants of the 1927 Dole Air Race that had reversed the route. Her trailblazing flight had mainly routine with no mechanical breakdowns. In her final hours, she actually relaxed and listened to the broadcast of the Metropolitan Opera from New York. That year, once more flying her Lockheed Vega airline that Earhart has tagged Old Bessie the Firehorse, she flew solo from Los Angeles to Mexico City on April 19th. The next record attempt was a non-stop flight from Mexico City to New York. Setting off on May 8th, the flight was uneventful, even though large crowds had greeted her at Newark, New Jersey, were concerned because she had to be careful not to taxi into the throng. Oops. Earhart again. Yeah. Oh, darn, look at that. Somebody got cut up. Earhart again participated in long-distance air racing, placing fifth in the Bendix Trophy race, the best result she could manage because of her stock Lockheed Vega was topped out at 195 miles per hour, was outclassed by purpose-built air racers, which reached more than 300 miles per hour. The race had a particularly difficult one as a competitor. Cecil Allen died in a fiery takeoff mishap, and rival Jacqueline Cochran was forced to pull out due to mechanical problems. In addition, blinding fog and violent thunderstorms plagued the race. Sounds like they're having a really good day for a race.
Yes.
Between 1930 and 35, Earhart had set 7 women's speeds and distance aviation records in a variety of aircraft, including a Kidder Airster, Lockheed Vega, and Pitcairn Autogyro. By 1935, recognizing limitations of her lovely red Vega in the long transoceanic flights, Earhart contemplated, in her own words, a new prize, one flight which I wanted to attempt, a circumnavigation of the globe as near its waistline as it could be. For the new venture, she would need a new aircraft. While Earhart was away on a speaking tour in late November 1934, a fire broke out at the Putnam residence in Rye, destroying many family treasures and Earhart's personal memories. Putnam had already sold his interest in the New York-based publishing company to his cousin, Palmer Putnam, and following the fire, they decided to move to the West Coast, where Putnam took up a new position as the head of the editorial board at Paramount Pictures in North Hollywood. While speaking in California in late 1934, Earhart had contacted Hollywood stunt pilot Paul Mance in order to improve her flying, focusing especially on long-distance flying in her Vega, and wanted to move closer to him. At Earhart's urging, Putnam purchased a small house in June 1935 adjacent to the clubhouse on the Lakeside Golf Club in Toluca Lake, California, a San Fernando Valley celebrity enclave community nestled between the Warner Brothers and Universal Pictures studio complexes, where they had earlier rented a temporary residence. Earhart and Putnam would not move in immediately, however. They decided to do considerable remodeling and enlarge the existing small structure to meet their needs. This delayed the occupation of their new home for several months. In September of 1935, Earhart and Mance formally established a business partnership in which they had been considering since late 1934, creating the short-lived Earhart-Mance Flying School, in which Mance controlled and operated through his aviation company, the United Air Services. The company was located at the Burbank Airport, about 5 miles from the home. Putnam handled publicity for the school that primarily taught instrument flying using linked trainers. Now, the planning in 1935 was started for a world flight, and she joined with Purdue University as a visiting faculty member to consult women on careers and a technical advisor to the Department of Aeronautics. In early 1936, Earhart started planning the round-the-world flight. Although others had flown around the world, her flight would be the longest at 29,000 miles. Because it followed a roughly equator route with financing from Purdue, in 1936, a Lockheed Electra 10E was built at the Lockheed Aircraft Company to her specifications, which included extensive modifications to the fuselage to incorporate many additional fuel tanks. Earhart dubbed the twin-engine monoplane her flying laboratory. The plane was built at Lockheed's Burbank, California plant, and after delivery it was hangared at Mance's United Air Services, which was just across the airfield from the Lockheed plant. Although the Electra was publicized as a flying laboratory, little useful science was planned, and the flight was arranged around Earhart's intention to circumnavigate the globe, along with gathering raw material and public attention for her next book. Earhart chose Captain Harry Manning as her navigator. He had been the captain of the President Roosevelt, the ship which had brought Earhart back from Europe in 1928. Manning was not only a navigator, but he was also a pilot and a skilled radio operator who knew Morse code. The original plan was to be a two-person crew. Earhart would fly and Manning would navigate. And during the flight across the country that included Manning, Earhart, and Putnam, Earhart flew using landmarks. She and Putnam knew where they were. Manning did a navigation fix, but that learned Putnam because Manning's position would put them in the wrong state. They were flying close to the state line, so the navigation error was minor, but Putnam was still concerned. Sometimes later, Putnam and Martz arranged a night flight to test Manning's navigational skill. Under poor navigational conditions, Manning's position was off by 20 miles.
Whoops.
Elvin M. and Marie K. Long consider Manning's performance reasonable because it was within an acceptable error of 30 miles, but Mance and Putnam wanted a better navigator. Though contacts with the Los Angeles aviation community, Fred Noonan was subsequently chosen as a second navigator because there were significant additional factors that had to be dealt with while using celestial navigation for the aircraft. Noonan was experienced in both marine. He was a licensed ship captain and a flight navigator. Noonan had recently left Pan Am, where he had established most of the company's China Clipper seaplane routes across the Pacific. Noonan also had been responsible for traveling and training Pan Am's navigators for the route between San Francisco and Manila. The original plans for Noonan to navigate from Hawaii to Howland Island, a particularly difficult portion of the flight. Then Manning would continue with Earhart to Australia, where she would proceed on her own for the remainder of the project. Now, the first flight came out of in 1937, March 17th. Her crew took off the first leg from Oakland, California, to Honolulu, Hawaii. In addition to Earhart and Noonan, Harry Manning and Mance, who was acting as Earhart's technical advisor, were on board. Due to lubrication and galling problems with the propeller hub's variable pitch mechanisms, the aircraft needed servicing in Hawaii. Ultimately, the Electra ended up on the United States Navy's Luke Field on Ford Island in Pearl Harbor. The flight resumed 3 days later from Luke Field with Earhart, Noonan, and Manning on board. The next destination was Howland Island, a small island in the Pacific. Manning, the only skilled radio operator, had made arrangements to use radio direction finding to home in on the island. The flight never left Luke Field. During the takeoff run, there was an uncontrolled ground loop. The forward landing gear collapsed, both propellers hit the ground, and the plane skidded on the belly, and a portion of the runway was damaged. The cause of the ground loop is controversial. Some witnesses at Luke Field, including the Associated Press journalist, said they saw a tire blow. Earhart thought either the Electra's right tire had blown and or the right landing gear had collapsed. Some witnesses, including Mance, cited pilot error. With the aircraft severely damaged, the flight was called off and the aircraft was shipped by sea back to the Lockheed Burbank facility for repairs. Manning, having taken a leave from absence to do the flight, felt there had been too many problems and delays. He ended his association with the trip, leaving only Earhart with Noonan, neither of whom were skilled radio operators. Now, while the aircraft was being repaired, Earhart and Putnam secured additional funding and prepared for a second attempt. This time, flying west to east, the second attempt began with an unpublicized flight from Oakland to Miami, Florida, and after there arriving, Earhart publicly announced her plans to circumnavigate the globe. The flight's opposite direction was partially the result of changes in global wind and the patterns along the planned route since the earlier attempt. On this second flight, Fred Noonan was Earhart's only crew member. The pilot departed Miami on June 1st, and after numerous stops in South America, Africa, the Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia, they arrived at Lae, New Guinea, on June 29, 1937. At this stage, about 22,000 miles of the journey had been completed. The remaining 7,000 miles would be over the Pacific. Now, as we go through all these fun little hops, the departure from Lae was July the 27th, 1937 at 10 a.m. in the morning. Earhart and Noonan took off from the Lae airfield in a heavily loaded Electra. Their intended destination was the Howland Island, a flat sliver of land 6,500 feet long and 1,600 feet wide, 10 feet high, and 2,556 miles away. Go ahead and let's look at this idea. You're going to try to take a great big plane. You're looking for this little tiny island out in the Pacific.
Sounds like a good idea. Let's do it.
And neither of these folks are trained real heavily in radio.
It sounds like a great idea. Let's do it.
Yeah. Now, the other hard part comes into here. It said the expected flying time was about 20 hours. So accounting for the 2-hour time zone difference between Lae and Howland and the crossing of the international date line, the aircraft was expected to arrive the next day in the morning, July the 2nd. The departed aircraft left with about 1,100 gallons of gasoline. Now, in March 1937, Kelly Johnson had recommended the engine and altitude settings for the Electra. One of these recommended schedules, they're showing fuel consumption rates depending on your altitude. You know, if they stayed at 10,000 feet, RPMs of 1,600, 24 inches, full throttle, fuel consumption 38 gallons per hour. They'd have 15.7 hours calculated. They would be really, you know, you're talking fuel consumption that would be almost physically impossible. Earhart used part of the above schedule for the Oakland to Honolulu leg for the first world attempt, and Johnson estimated that 900 gallons of fuel would provide 40% more range than required for that leg. Using 900 gallons of 250 gallons less than the Electra's maximum fuel tank capacity, that meant a weight savings of 1,500 pounds, so Earhart included Mance as a passenger on that leg. The Oakland to Honolulu leg had Earhart, Noonan, Manning, and Mance on board. The flight from Oakland to Honolulu took 16 hours. The Electra was also loaded with 900 gallons of fuel for the shorter Honolulu to Howland leg, with only Earhart, Noonan, and Manning on board, but the airplane crashed on the takeoff. The crash ended the world's first flight attempt. We were mentioning that earlier. Now, around 3 o'clock Lae time, Earhart reported her altitude as 10,000 feet, but they would reduce altitude due to thick clouds. Around 5 p.m., Earhart reported her altitude at 7,000 feet. Speed was at 250 knots. Now, the last known position report was near the Nukumanu Islands, about 800 miles into the flight. During the flight, Noonan may have been able to do some celestial navigation to determine his position. If the cross the international date line was not taken into account, a 1 degree or 60-mile position error would result. Now, in preparation for the trip to the Howland Island, the U.S. Coast Guard had sent the cutter, the USCGC Isaka, to the island. The cutter offered many services such as ferrying news reports to the island, but also had communication and navigation functions. The plan was the cutter could communicate with the Earhart's aircraft via radio, transmit a radio homing signal and make it easy to find Howland Island without precise celestial navigations, do radio detection finding if Earhart used her 500 kilohertz transmitter, use an experimental high-frequency detection finder for Earhart's voice transmissions, and use her boilers to make smoke, which was to create a column of smoke that could be seen over the horizon. All of the navigation methods would fail to guide Earhart to the Howland Island. Now, the Electra had radio equipment for both communication and navigation, but details about that equipment are not clear. The Electra failed to establish the two-way radio communications with the Osaka and failed to radio locate the Osaka. Many of the explanations have been proposed for those features. It led to those failures. The plane had a modified Western Electric Model 13C transmitter. The 50-watt transmitter was a crystal controlled capable of transmitting on 500 kilohertz, 3,105 kilohertz, and 6210 kilohertz. Crystal control means that the transmitter cannot be tuned to other frequencies. The plane could only transmit on these three frequencies, and the transmitter had been modified at the factory to provide the 500 kilohertz capability. So the plane and the ship should have had communication ability. The plane also had a modified Western Electric Model 20B receiver. Ordinarily, this receiver covered four frequency bands, 188 to 420 kilohertz, 550 to 1500 kilohertz, 15 to 4000 kilohertz, and 4000 to 10,000 kilohertz. The receiver was modified to lower the frequencies in the second band to 485 to 1200 kilohertz. This modification allowed the reception of 500 kilohertz signals. Such signals were used for marine distress calls and radio navigation. The Model 20B receiver had two antenna inputs, a low-frequency antenna input and a high-frequency antenna input. The receiver's band selector also selects the antenna input is used. The first two bands use the low-frequency antenna. The last two bands select the high-frequency antenna. It is unknown whether the Model 20B receiver had a beat frequency oscillator, which would enable the detection of continuous wave transmissions, such as a Morse code or radio location beacons. Neither Earhart nor Noonan were capable of using Morse code. They relied on voice communications. Manning, who was the first world flight attempt but not in the second, was skilled at Morse and had acquired a FCC aircraft radio telegraph license for 15 words per minute in March 1927, just prior to the start of the first flight. A separate automatic radio direction receiver finder, prototype Hoven radio compass, had been installed in the plane in October 1936, but that receiver had been removed before the flight to save weight. The Hoven radio compass was replaced by a Bendix coupling unit that allowed a conventional loop antenna to be attached to the existing receiver. The loop's antenna is visible above the cockpit in Earhart's plane. That's that neat little circle thing that they show on the pictures. Alternatively, the loop antenna may have been connected to a Bendix RA1 auxiliary receiver with direction finding capability of 1500 kilohertz. It is not clear that such a receiver was installed, and if it were there, it may have been removed before the flight. Elgin and Marie Long described Joe Gurr training Earhart to use the Bendix receiver and other equipment to tune radio station KFI on 620 kilohertz to determine its direction. Whatever receiver was used, there were pictures of Earhart's radio finder loop antenna and its 5-band Bendix coupling unit. The details of the loop and the coupler are not clear. Elgin and Marie Long claimed that the coupling unit adapted a standard RDF 1B loop to the RA1 receiver, and that the system was limited to the frequency below 1430 kilohertz. During the first world flight's attempt leg from Honolulu to Howland, where Manning was a navigator, the Osaka was supposed to transmit a CW homing beacon at either 375 kilohertz or 500 kilohertz. At least twice during the world flight, Earhart failed to determine radio bearings at 7,500 kilohertz. If the RDF equipment was not suitable to that frequency, then attempting such a fix would be operator error and fruitless. However, the earlier 7-band Navy RDF-1A covered the 5,000 to 8,000 kilohertz, and the later 3-band DU-1 covered 200 to 1,600 kilohertz. It's not clear whether the RDF-1B or Earhart's coupler performance sits between these two units. In addition, the RDF-1A and DU-1 coupler designs have other differences. The intention was to have the ordinary receive antenna connected to the coupler's antenna input, and from there it is passed to the receiver. In the RDF-1A design, the coupler must be powered on for that function to work. If the later DU-1 design, the coupler need not to be powered. Now, there are also problems with the RDF equipment during the world flight. During the transatlantic leg of the flight from Brazil to Africa, the RDF equipment did not work. The radio direction finding station at Darwin expected to be in contact with Earhart when she arrived there, but Earhart stated the RDF was not functioning. The problem was a blown fuse. During a test flight at Ley, Earhart could hear radio signals, but she failed to obtain an RDF bearing. Apparently, near Howland Island, Earhart reported receiving a 7,500 kilohertz signal from the Asaka, but was unable to obtain an RDF bearing. Now, the antennas and their connections on the Electra are not certain. A dorsal D antenna was added to the Bell by the Bell Telephone Laboratories. There had been a trailing wire antenna for 500 kilohertz, but the Luke Field accident collapsed both the landing gear and wiped off the ventral antennas. After the accident, the trailing wire antenna was removed, the dorsal antenna was modified, and the ventral antenna was installed. It's not certain, but it is likely that the dorsal antenna was only connected to the transmitter, i.e. no break-in relay, and the ventral antenna was only connected to the receiver. Once the Second World Flight started, problems with the radio reception were noticed while flying across the U.S. Pan Am technicians may have modified this ventral antenna while the plane was in Miami. At Ley, problems with the transmission quality at 6210 kilohertz were noticed. Once the flight took off from Ley, Lee did not receive any radio messages on the 6210 kilohertz until 4 hours later at 2:18 p.m. Ley's last reception was at 5:18 p.m., and there was a strong signal. Ley reported nothing after that. Presumably, the plane switched to 3105 kilohertz, Earhart's nighttime frequency. Now, the Asaka did hear Earhart on 301005, but did not hear her on the 6210 kilohertz. Traeger postulates that the ventral receiving antenna was scraped off when the Elantra taxied to the runway at Ley. Consequently, the Electra lost its ability to receive HF transmissions, high frequency. Now, again, the Coast Guard ship was stationed at Howland. It was tasked with communicating with the plane and guiding them to the island once they received the vicinity. Noonan and Earhart expected to do voice communications on the 301005 during the night and the 6210 kilohertz during the day. Through a series of misunderstandings or errors, the details of which are still controversial, the final approach to Howland Island using radio navigation was not successful. Fred Noonan had earlier written about problems affecting the quality of radio direction finding and navigation. Another cited cause of possible confusion was that the Asaka and the Earhart planned their communication schedule using the time sequences set a half an hour apart, with Earhart using the Greenwich Civil Time and the Asaka under Naval Time Designation System. The Electra expected the Asaka to transmit signals that the Electra could use as an RDF beacon to find the Asaka. In theory, the plane could listen for the signal while rotating its loop antenna. A sharp minimum indicates the direction of an RDF beacon. The Electra's RDF equipment had failed due to a blown fuse during an earlier leg, and the fuse was replaced. Near Howland, Earhart could hear the transmission from the Asaka on the 7500 band, but she was unable to determine a minimum, so she could not determine the direction. Earhart was also unable to determine a minimum during an RDF test on Ley. One likely theory was that the RDF equipment did not work at 7500. Most RDF equipment at the time was not designed to work above 2000. While operating their design frequency, loop antennas lose their directionality. Now, the Osaka had its own RDF equipment, but that equipment did not work above 5,500, 550 kilohertz, so Osaka could not determine the direction of the Electra's HF transmissions at 3105 and 6210 kilohertz. The Electra had been equipped to transmit a 500 kilohertz signal, which the Osaka could use for radio direction finding, but some of the equipment had been removed. The equipment originally used a long trailing wire antenna. While the plane was in flight, the wire antenna would have been paid out at the tail. The efficient transmissions at 500 needed a long antenna. The antenna was bulky and heavy, so the trailing wire was removed to save weight. If nothing else had been done, the plane would have been unable to transmit an RDF signal that Osaka could use. Such a modification was made, but without voice communication to the plane, the ship could not tell the plane to use its 500 kilohertz signal. Even if the Osaka could get the bearing to the plane, it could not tell the plane the bearing, so the plane could not head to the ship. It's kind of like a comedy of errors, which winds up costing two people their lives. Now, some sources have noted Earhart's apparent lack of understanding in her directional finding system, which had been fitted to the aircraft just prior to the flight. The system was equipped with a Bendix system. And let me pull this up here. And it operated on 5 wavelength bands, marked 1 through 5. The loop antenna was equipped with a tunable loading coil that changed the effective length of the antenna to allow it to work efficiently at different wavelengths. The tuner on the antenna, even though it was set critically, there were not the same frequency bands as the corresponding bands on the radio. The two were close enough for settings 1, 2, and 3, but the higher frequency settings 4 and 5 were entirely different. The upper bands could not be used for direction finding. Earhart's only training on the system was a brief introduction by Joe Gurr at the Lockheed factory, and the topic had not come up. The card displaying the band settings on the antenna was mounted so it was not visible. Gurr explained the higher frequency bands would offer better accuracy and longer range. Now, motion picture evidence from Lay suggests that the antenna mounted underneath the fuselage may have been torn off from the fuel-heavy Electra during taxi or takeoff from Lay's runway, though no antenna was reported found at Lay. And while during Earhart and Noonan's approach to the Howland Island, the Osaka did receive strong, clear voice transmissions from Earhart, identifying as KHAQQ, but she apparently was unable to hear voice transmissions from the ship. Signals from the ship would also be used for direction finding, implying that the aircraft's direction finder was not functional. The first calls, routine reports, stated the weather is cloudy and overcast, was received at 2:45 and just before 5 a.m. on July the 2nd. These calls were broken up by static, but at this point the aircraft would still be a long distance from Howland. At 6:14 a.m. another call was received, stated the aircraft was within 200 miles, and requested the ship use this direction finder to provide a bearing for the aircraft. Earhart began whistling into the microphone to provide a continual signal for them to home in on. It was at this point that the radio operators on the ship realized that their RDS system could not tune into the aircraft's frequency at 3105 kilohertz, and Radio Leo Bellarts later commented that he was sitting there sweating blood because I couldn't do a darn thing about it. A similar call for a bearing was received about 6:45 a.m. when Earhart estimated that they were 100 miles out. And a radio log, position 1 at 7:40 a.m. states, Earhart on Southwest says running out of gas, only 1.5 hour left, can't hear us at all. We hear her and are sending on 3105 ES 500 same time constantly. A second message comes in 2 minutes later stating, Earhart's plane, we must be on you but cannot see you. Gas is running low, but unable to reach you by radio. We are flying at 1,000 feet. Now, Earhart's 7:58 a.m. transmission said she could not hear the Osaka and asked them to send voice signals so she could try to get a radio bearing. The transmission was reported by the Osaka as the loudest possible signal, indicating Earhart and Noonan were in the immediate area. They could not send voice at the frequency she asked for, so Morse code signals were sent instead. Earhart acknowledged receiving these, but said she was unable to determine their direction. Now, the last known transmission at 8:43 a.m., Earhart broadcast, "We are on line 157337. We will repeat this message. We will repeat this on 6210 kilocycles. Wait." However, a few moments later, she was back on the same frequency, 3105 kilohertz, with the transmission as logged as questionable. "We are running on a line north and south." Earhart's transmission seems to indicate that she and Noonan believe they had reached Howland's charted position, which is incorrect by about 5 nautical miles. The Osaka had used her oil-fired boilers to generate smoke for a period of time, but the flyers apparently did not see it. The many scattered clouds in the area around Howland's Island have cited as a problem. Dark shadows on the ocean surface might have been almost indistinguishable from the island's subdued and very flat profile. Whether any post-loss radio signals were received from Earhart or Noonan remains unclear. The transmissions were received from the Electra. Most, if not all, were weak and hopelessly garbled. Earhart's voice transmissions to Howland were on 3105 kilohertz, a frequency restricted in the United States by the FCC for aviation use. This frequency was thought to be not fit for broadcast over great distances. When Earhart was at cruising altitude midway from Ley to Howland, neither station heard or scheduled transmission at 8:15 GCT. Moreover, the 50-watt transmitter used by Earhart was attached to a less than optimum length 5-type antenna. Now, the last voice transmission received by the Howland Island from Earhart indicated she and Noonan were flying along a line of position, running north to south on 157.337 degrees, which Noonan would have calculated and drawn on a chart passing through Howland. After all the contact was lost on Howland Island, attempts were made to reach the flyers with both voice and Morse code transmissions. Operators on the Pacific and the United States may have heard signals from the downed Electra, but were unintelligible or weak. Some of the reports of transmissions were later determined to be hoaxes, but others were deemed authentic. Bearings by Pan American Airways stations suggested signals originating from several locations, including Gardner Island, Nakamura, 360 miles to the south-southeast, and it was noted at the time that these signals were from Earhart and Noonan. They must have been on the land with the aircraft, since water would have otherwise shorted out the Electra's electrical system. Sporadic signals were reported for 4 to 5 days after the disappearance, but none were yielded any understandable information. The captain of the USS Colorado later said, "There is no doubt many stations were calling the Earhart plane on the plane's frequency, some by voice and others by signals. All of these added to the confusion and doubtfulness of the authenticity of the reports." Well, beginning approximately 1 hour after Earhart's last recorded message, the Osaka undertook an ultimately unsuccessful search north and west of the Howland Island, based on initial assumptions of the transmission of the aircraft. The United States Navy soon joined the search, and over a period of about 3 days, sent available resources to search the area in the vicinity of the Howland Island. The initial search involved running up and down the 157/337 line of position from north-northwest from Howland Island. The Osaka searched the area of the immediately northeast of the island, corresponding with the area, and yet wider the area searching to the northwest. Based on the bearings of supposed Earhart radio transmissions, some of the search efforts directed a specific position on a line of 281 degrees, approximately northwest from Howland Island, without any evidence of the flyers. 4 days after Earhart's last verified radio transmission on July the 6th, the captain of the battleship Colorado received orders from the Commandant, 14th Naval District, to take over all naval and Coast Guard units to coordinate search efforts. Later search efforts were directed to the Phoenix Islands south of Howland Island. A week after the disappearance, naval aircraft from the Colorado flew over several islands, including the Gardner Island, now called Nakamura, which had been uninhabited for over 40 years. The subsequent report of Gardner said, Here, signs of recent habitation were clearly visible, but repeated circling and zooming failed to elicit any answering wave from possible inhabitants, and it was finally taken for granted that none were there. At the western end of the island, a tramp steamer lay high and almost dry head on the coral beach with her back broken in two places. The lagoon at Gardner looked sufficiently deep and certainly large enough so that a seaplane or even an airboat could have landed and taken off in any direction with little, if any, difficulty. Given the chance, it is believed that Mr. Earhart could have either landed the aircraft on the lagoon or swum or waded ashore. They also found that Gardner's shape and size, as recorded in the charts, was wholly inaccurate. Other Navy ship efforts were again directed north, west, and southwest of the Howland Island, based on the possibility the Electra had ditched in the ocean, was afloat, or that aviators were in an emergency raft. The official search efforts lasted until July 19th, 1937. At $4 million, the air and sea search of the Navy and the Coast Guard were the most costly and extensive in U.S. history at the time, but search and rescue techniques during the era were rudimentary, and some of the search was based on erroneous assumptions and flawed information. Other reporting of the search effort was influenced by individuals, vary how their roles in looking for an American hero might be reported to the press. Despite the unprecedented search by the Navy and Coast Guard, no physical evidence of Earhart, Noonan, or the Electra were ever found. Even the U.S. aircraft carrier, the Lexington, the battleship Colorado, the Osaka, the Japanese oceanographic survey vessel Koshu, and the Japanese seaplane tender Kamoi searched for 6 to 7 days in the search, covering 150,000 square miles. Immediately after the end of the official search, Putnam financed a private search by local authorities in the nearby Pacific Islands and waters, concentrating on the Gilberts. In late July 1937, partner chartered 2 small boats, and while he remained in the United States, directed a search of the Phoenix Islands, the Christmas Island, Fanning, the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, but no trace of the Electra and its occupants were ever found. Back in the United States, Putnam acted to become the trustee of the Earhart estate so he could pay for the searches and related bills in probate court, Los Angeles. He requested to have her declared death in absentia, 7-year waiting period waived so he could manage Earhart's finances. As a result, Earhart was declared legally dead on January the 5th, 1939. And even to this day, there have been several various efforts to try to pin down exactly where she went down. Even Josh Gates has been seen working on some of the smaller islands, looking at places where they found plane components. A lot of it that they've seen comes from speculation on not only the twin incidences where the plane crashed in Hawaii, but also the plane that took off from Lae Airport in New Guinea. There was some speculation that the plane actually did survive landing, and they have been trying to use radio ground penetrating radar to see what they can find on some of these islands. To my date, from what I've, depending what link you want to follow on the internet, there are some other speculations. But as far as I know, it was a sad ending for one of the greatest female aviators in history.
Mostly because it sounded like they tried to cut corners to make the weight of the plane less.
Yeah, and the fact is that the one guy they probably should have had on there got off out of Hawaii, and they weren't smart enough to bring in another radio transmission guy or spend the proper time to research how to operate these systems.
What?
Exactly. So, but anyway, folks, this is Joe, the Bearded Historian. Again, turn in your papers, page 3. I'll sign off for the college credit. You folks have a good evening out there, okay?